Hello, and welcome to the second part of our discussions within the realm of multiculturalism and multilingualism. Uh, in this section, I'd really like to focus on elements such as why is it okay, or what are the benefits of being a multilingual person. Well, let's assume that currently the factor of progress is sustainable economic development, linking, well, the environmental dimension with the economic, and social development and quality of human capital, right? In accordance or in reference to a program called Horizon 2020, a program that was devised by the Polish Academy of National Science, it is suggested that the modernization of employment structure in order to prepare staff for the new so-called jobs of the future will require multilinguals, uh, connecting on all fronts, so to speak. So knowledge of the rapidly changing labor market allows one to create educational programs, conduct workshops, and create new majors that will allow future students and and then future workers and allow them to enter the ever-changing job market. So if we hear that multilingualism, so more than one language, will be required as an element of success for these young people, then naturally your future, in other words, you are investing in the future of your child from the very beginning by maintaining that multilingual perspective. So according to the ABSL report of 2000, I think it was 2019, on the sector of modern businesses, employment in such institutions has risen by over 25%. And that has happened during the last 2 years. And we can talk about potentially a rise, and especially now where COVID made us go into this hybrid internet connected world, these markets are growing. So one thing that we have to assume from the very beginning is that communication in its main sense should not be confused with linguistics. In other words, this is the process of information exchange between participants that occurs on many levels, including the intercultural, which we've mentioned before, the social, and of course the marketing. And language becomes a tool for the user, essential to reach a set of goals. So in this sense, employers will now require that their future employees have basic intercultural communication skills, which differ, quite frankly, from just basic knowledge of language. That's why, as I mentioned in the previous webinar, intercultural communication is such an extremely important thing. And that begins with obtaining knowledge of the foreign language. So the first phase is basically to prepare them to have communicative and linguistic competence. And that's going to be crucial in everyday professional life. It's going to allow them to cross these barriers that they've been put on for the last couple of years, and which will now allow future children or children of the future to prepare their realities by successfully looking at a well interconnected, multilingual, multi-communicative, and multicultural world. I will now share my screen in a moment for a short presentation that I have on the basics of communication. Because again, just like understanding intercultural, you have to understand what these basics of communication are. So we'll call this a theoretical and practical aspect of talking about what communication actually is. So first of all, you must understand that communication is so deeply rooted in human behavior and the structures of society, therefore making it difficult to exclude social or behavioral events in communication theory. So if we treat language as a behavior, when we're talking about multilingualism, we're talking about a set of tools. A set of tools that you use, and the more tools you have, the better the product will become. And in this case, we're talking about managing the information flow. So basic communication model involves a sender transferring a message containing information to a receiver. Sounds simple, but it's a bit more complicated when we look at all those those small aspects. I'd like to focus your attention on three core principles. One of them, as I already mentioned in the previous webinar, will be the tool, the language. Now, language is an arbitrary system of signs used in a society for communication. Language entails meaning or has meaning, and that meaning is a representation of thoughts. So if we look at this from a pyramidal standpoint, then one does not exist without the other. It's a closed loop. So you use a tool, you use an arbitrary system of signs, and we've already discussed what arbitrariness is. An arbitrary system of signs, which then we create meaning and then allow so that humans can express thought. So if we're talking about multilinguals, multilinguals have this ability to do this on different levels. And that connects with what was said previously about interculturalism. So if you are capable as a multilingual to be able to function within this pyramid scheme, then you're actually capable of conveying thought. And it is understanding thought that is the most important element for communication studies. Now, there are various viewpoints into how to properly, focus on communication. There's the mechanistic, and this view considers communication as a perfect transaction of a message from the sender to the receiver, as seen in what I would say the diagram above. So going sender, hearer, and then it's a perfect exposure. So you just see it as pure mechanical. But there's also systemic. This view considers communication to be the new message created via throughput, or what happens as the message is being interpreted and reinterpreted all the time as it's traveling between information channels. So this is the more tricky part. And many of us have probably once in their lives actually uttered this sentence, well, I'm sorry, that's not what I meant. Well, because we're seeing how the message is being directly reinterpreted and overinterpreted in time to see if there's a gap in the system. There's a very simple thing you can do. If you line up a couple of people and whisper something into the ear of a person at the beginning, and then ask that person to turn around and whisper to the ear of the person standing next to him, and so on and so forth with the channel moving, then it's interesting whether the original message and the final message will be exactly the same. Now, if something went wrong in the systemic model, then that means that while the message was traveling between between one speaker and another, there was something that didn't exactly work, and the message got distorted. That's why it's extremely important for us as communication experts and those people who are focusing on dealing with these situations that we try to pinpoint exactly where it went wrong. Now, we have to see how much of the message was distorted. And this exactly happens in this multicultural element, that because we're working in and multilingual, of course, as well, if we're working in these two different systems, right, the fact that there can be a lack of proper connection or misinterpretation is more than 100%. Because, as mentioned earlier, people think in their languages, and their languages allow them to perceive reality. There's the psychological approach, and this view considers communication as the act of sending a message to a receiver and the feelings and thoughts of the receiver upon interpreting the message, right? So in other words, by saying something, we're actually psychologically connecting to another person. So the way we say it, the way it is intended to be said, is extremely important, because if it is not done the way it was originally intended, it might turn out that we're, again, influencing in the right or wrong way the person to whom we're listening to. So in this case, if again, multilinguals are capable in handling the pyramid diagram and working within this scheme, it's all the better, or all the power to them. And there's finally the critical approach, which considers communication as a source of power and oppression of individuals and social groups. So yes, you can use your voice and use communicative patterns in such ways to manipulate. And if we have different systems, we have different systematic approaches, which results from these languages and these cultures, then naturally they will influence your interpretation. So this basically means that in order to communicate properly as a multilingual, you will be capable of meandering, as I said, between these standpoints. Then we have something which is called cognitive dissonance. This theory argues that the experience of dissonance is averse, and people are highly motivated to avoid it. In their efforts to avoid feelings of dissonance, people will avoid hearing views that oppose their own, change their beliefs to match their actions, and seek reassurance after making a difficult decision. This means, again, that people don't like it when you tell them that something is wrong. Communicating properly, we will see a psychological reaction of people taking a direct stance and saying, I'm not going to do this. I'm not ready for this. I will not be doing it, right? So again, multilinguals will have this ability to handle such situations better because they know how to do it on so many fundamentally different on so many different levels. Now, theorists in coordinated management of meaning believe that in conversation, people co-create meaning by attaining some coherence and coordination. So it's naturally going to be easy if people from two different cultures, two different languages, to manage the meaning if they are both on the same page. So if I am an experienced multilingual, let's say in Polish and English, and somebody else is an experienced multilingual in, I don't know, Spanish and French, right? Then already certain traits that these people have in being capable of managing meaning allows them to have a unique element, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of this small talk, is a requirement on the job market. So dear parents, you're actually investing in your child. You're not only maintaining your cultural and historical, heritage, you're actually giving the child a tool that is far more, that it will equip him or her far better in the future. So coherence occurs when stories are told, and coordination exists when stories are lived. Therefore, this allowance for interaction between these groups is something that that empowers that person very much so. The cultural approach contends that people are like animals who are suspended in webs that they created. And they argue that an organization's culture is composed of shared symbols, each of which has unique meaning. I've mentioned this before in my previous webinar. However, I believe that in this context of communication, it's extremely important. If we look at multinational corporations where we have a mix of cultures, people have to coexist with each other, but also various languages that are functioning, right? So in this, organizational stories, rituals, and rites of passage are examples of what constitutes that cultural organization. Here, I'd like to make you aware of a philosopher of language whose name was Paul Grice. And Paul Grice talked about 4 conversational maxims that you need to adhere to, in other words, refer to when you're talking about communicating. So first of all, you have the maxim of quantity, right? The maxim of quantity, which means make your contribution as informative as is required at the given moment. That contribution can't be overload, can't be more than is capable of being handled at a given moment. So don't say too much, right? If you say too much, sometimes the meaning might get lost. The maxim of quality, do not say what you believe to be false. So do not say something if you lack adequate evidence, right? So in other words, speak the truth. He also talked about the relevance, the maxim of relevance, and he talked about the maxim of manner. So relevance, say what was only relevant to the discussion at this point. And manner, say it in a way that is non-ambiguous, right? So that will be clearly understood. And multilinguals have this ability to manage this because they understand that when they code switch from one language to another, there's a lot of psychological processes going on there that allow those people to be effective in the way they communicate. But there's also another thing that we frequently disregard, and that's prosody. And prosody comes from poetry and refers to poetic meters or rhythms. It's basically spoken language over written language. So, and again, prosody is extremely important because the way you say it will then give you the interpretation, will then give you what is actually being said. So if I say, per se, this is the house that Jack built, then I'm pointing my finger at that house and saying, that house is the one that Jack built. But when I say, this is the house that Jack built, I'm saying it with disbelief. This is the house. Can you believe it? This is the house that Jack built. Jack, you know the guy from high school who never amounted to anything? He actually built the house. Yes, Jack. So each time that melody, that spoken language, right, you hear refers to rhythm, stress, intonation, and it shows and it signals the emotional state of the speaker. And it's that emotional state of the speaker that that tells us a lot. That tells us a lot about what the message is about. So as you can see, communication is extremely important because multilinguals, bilinguals, people who speak various languages and who, as a result, become are part of different cultures, then basically they interpret reality and they see connections that people with only one language obviously do not. So now comes the point where we ask ourselves, okay, bilingualism, what does it truly mean to be bilingual? Well, that's a very interesting question. Well, there are various definitions of bilingualism, and people sometimes ask, well, I speak English at work and Polish at home. Am I bilingual? Both yes and no at the same time. Because if we go into true bilingualism, in other words, that which starts sequentially at the very beginning, for what multilingual families are built on, then we have to be aware that we can divide bilingualism into simultaneous and sequential. So simultaneous bilingualism is learning several languages, as the name says, simultaneously. However, sequential is learning a language after the first one had already been learned, right? And therefore, from my experience, I'm a sequential bilingual person, because, or even a simultaneous one. And again, I spoke a bit of Polish, and then I went to the English school and started speaking English. So I'm a bit of this, I'm a bit of that. It's extremely difficult to, but I would say that I am part simultaneous and part sequential. And then we have the additive bilingualism. The second language is acquired without any deterrent to the speaker's native language. And we have subtractive. The second language is acquired and the speaker's native language deteriorates. I spoke French as a third language at one point because originally from Montreal in Quebec, we would speak Quebecois. But I stopped using it, and the fact that my third language became subtracted. And that also, again, showed me how important it is for people to maintain using those languages. Maintaining that, because if the child stops using them at any one given point, then, well, this might happen to you. This might happen to you. So Białystok, who was a researcher, wrote a paper that suggested that bilingual children might develop improved cognitive control systems compared to monolingual children as a result of switching and attentional control demands from the very early age. So in other words, exposing a young child as early to the code switch might actually allow that person to become more proficient. So bilingual children have the capacity to become exceptionally proficient at these switching abilities, right? I can switch my English and my Polish anytime in a given sentence, and I'm subconsciously doing it, not even thinking of what I'm doing. Więc ja mogę talk about this w wielu różnych językach I robić to whenever I want to, na jakikolwiek path ja chcę. Right, so you can see I was mixing those things, and that sentence actually made sense, right? So the bilingual advantage seems to be related to the attention control while information processing. Since users of 2 or more, or even more codes need to constantly monitor their performance, right? That's key here. They need to monitor their performance as it is appropriateness in terms of the choice of language items available in the bilingual mental lexicon, right? Their executive control is constantly in use, right? I'm talking now in English, and it's very natural for me, and I'm not even thinking. And then when I switch to Polish, the same thing happens. So the activities will be designed, so these activities that we've designed them in such a way so that you as parents can go into them and start playing with languages. So I'll now share my screen again as I have another presentation to show. And of course, this is connected to Multilingual Families Clubs and promoting linguistic and cultural treasure of Europe. And so our main methodological goal was to go along with one premise. Multiple language families should aim for retaining bilingualism and multilingualism amongst their children so as to foster the retention of their parents' culture through language and give them abilities for the workforce to obtain a better job by giving them an advantage in a globalized world. Many of you might ask the question, who am I? So that's the question of identity. Language is culture, and culture is identity. You can absolutely see that the reality in which these young students and these young children function are quite different than when we were younger as kids. Now, because the world is globalized. We need to focus on what we call today 20th century skills, right? And that is something that our manual was based on. So we wanted to go from the PBL approach. That is the project-based learning, which integrates knowing and doing. Students learn knowledge and elements of the core curriculum, but also apply what they know to solve authentic problems, right? That is the main thing. So doing. I know this is done at a higher level of teaching languages, etc. But if you take that idea, that if the child does something with the language, if he uses it in context, and in this case also your cultural heritage, then that child will create this behavior, will create linguistic behavior that is adequate at a given position. So basically you identify the problem, you analyze, find studies, field and studies and investigation, identify resources and research, test solutions, and then you present your solutions. It's like a cycle, right? So the more you do, the more you know. The more you know because you discover things going along the way. So what we chose was the main category for choosing the activities. They should be age-based. We should separate categories and should be created for what we call the 0-6 group and the 6-10 group. The idea was that younger group will be focused on the development of their cognitive skills, while the older age group will focus on the element of something that is extremely important today. And you've probably heard this as a balloon term or an umbrella term. It's called soft skills. So the abilities to communicate, the abilities to transfer meaning. So the choice for choosing activities should also be based on their cultural supporting effectiveness. So when we got together, the 0-6 group, nature refers to our biological endowment, the genes we receive from our parents. Nature refers to the environment, social as well as physical, that influence our development. Everything from the womb in which we develop before birth to the homes in which we grow up. So this was to us a key that these kids, when they start playing around with languages, you should start to allow your native language as a multilingual family to start that being an integral part of the household, right? An extremely integral part of the household so that it will feel natural, for the child. So here, speaking, listening, and writing and reading skills in that way. So first the child learns to speak, then he learns to listen, or listens first and then speaks, is able to put that into writing and then starts developing reading skills. So this is where you also focus on the phonological accuracy. In other words, the proper pronunciation. Okay, the proper pronunciation is extremely important at this point, because if you want your child to speak the language as if a native would, then that's where the listening part comes in, and that's where it begins. And how do you do that? You do that by role playing. You do that by role playing because that becomes the element that engages the child. The 6-10 group, here, we're not developing these cognitive skills anymore. We're improving them. Speaking, listening, writing, reading skills by integrating the use of supporting technology. So there's no running away from technology. It's all here to stay. Building character qualities, developing competencies, and increasing literacy. So getting that child going deeper into the rabbit hole in order to achieve the intended results. So if we're looking at 21st century skills, then we would assume that multilingualism and the capability of transferring interculturally and moving between elements in the pyramid scheme, which you remember, it's also a current skill. So we have foundational literacies, we have competencies, and we have character qualities. So in this sense, if your child grows up in a multilingual environment, if your child continues its path using these languages interchangeably and then fits into a culture and understands that culture, then that child has the additional 21st century skill that is needed. So here, as you can see, we decided to develop the age groups, as you can see, to the 06 and the 610. So the 06 group would be cognitive skills. Then we would have phonological skills, sentence structure, and role playing, while here, technology, competencies, characters, and literacy, and all these linked by culture supporting effectiveness. And I cannot stress this enough. The more exposure to a given cultural model, the better understanding of that culture, what that cultural model will be. So you must understand that you are, in fact, investing into your child's future, and that child's future will be connected with its ability to become multilingual. I'm just going to, excuse me, leave the presentation here. And thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed listening to this part. Uh, More to come, more interesting things that you may find out. But again, the whole concept, promote multilingualism, promote cultural heritage, that is the key to your child's future.